Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in today to Elisha's Bears. This is Pastor Danny. I want to thank you for the follow. And if you're not following the podcast, I would encourage you to do that. I'm terribly excited today to have one of my good friends, Brent McDougall, who is a pastor of First Baptist Church in Knoxville. We are recording this a few days before Halloween. We're having kind of a virtual roundtable today, Brent. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for the invitation.
You're welcome. Like I said, we've reached out to several of our other folks, and they were with us, but they were not part of us, apparently,
That's
on
right.
this particular recording. So thanks for hanging in there with me today. How long have you been in Knoxville?
So we moved to Knoxville in December of 2020, and that was the COVID year. So we made the move from Dallas, Texas, a church that I was serving there. And it was an interesting year to, of course, say goodbye one place and say hello in a new place. But have just loved Knoxville, loved the people, loved the city, and just grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, well, I've noticed, our churches handle Halloween in different ways, and that's what I really want to talk about a little bit. Some of your childhood experiences growing up with Halloween. Did you all, as a family,
Yeah.
observe Halloween?
We did. We would always go out trick or treating. I have good memories of that. I remember that my mother used to make my costume. So I don't know if other people had like store bought costumes, but my mom made every costume. And I remember one time she dressed me up as like, or I dressed up as like, I think like Jaws had come out, and I wanted to be a shark. So she special made a costume. And I remember it was made of felt. And to fill in the costume, she put a bunch of like, dry cleaning bags, in the top of it. And the effect of that, Danny, was that the inside the suit, it was approximately 180 degrees. And it was a choking hazard. I have no idea how I survived that moment, but
You have
but
any,
that's what
photographs
happened.
or anything of you're wearing this?
It's too embarrassing. I've actually tried to block it out, but I'm telling you because I want to help you with your podcast. So
Well, I appreciate your humoring
yeah.
me with that, and I'll use AI to add anything else I want you to say after the fact. Well, I know as we get older, we maybe we don't dress up like the children do, but if you could pick a biblical character or a famous preacher to dress up as, who would you pick?
Sure. I think I would probably honestly, it's the easy church answer. I'd probably dress up as Jesus. I think I'd try to rock that really kind of casual vibe, and grow my hair out a little bit. That's probably who I would choose because I think it would generate the most interesting conversations.
Did you need 12 other people as your entourage?
Right. I think that the entourage is, of course, the perk, and I don't think if Jesus were to go trick-or-treating, he probably wouldn't, of course, just get his disciples to gather the candy, so he would multiply it for his own behalf. I don't know, maybe something like that. I think you could have a lot of fun dressing up as Jesus.
Okay. Well, the last couple of days, I've been talking to someone in our church. He's from Korea, and we just had an event last night, kind of a trick or treat event, and I was thinking about him and this quote I was going to share with you. This was from Bronwyn Lee, and she was writing an article called "Her First American Halloween," and she grew up in South Africa, and no one really celebrated Halloween in South Africa, so she knew very little about it. But when she moved to the United States, and she was about 30 years old when she dressed up, what she said. She was about 8 months pregnant, and she said, "I was planning my first Halloween costume," and she dressed up as a soccer field, and she dressed in green with a black and white soccer ball painted on her belly, which we can see that. And she said, "That was also the first time I had heard of the Christian debate over Halloween,
Hmm. Mhm.
with a few partygoers muttering that I had no business honoring such a wicked and pagan festivity with her outfit." And I guess what I wanted to ask you, have you run into any that kind of reaction before with people
I
who have
have
issues with this?
Yes, on occasion, I've had people suggest that Halloween should not be observed. Maybe there needs to be an alternative to Halloween that families could go to. And I think oftentimes the pushback is on sometimes some of the costumes really do kind of glorify, blood and violence and they're playing off of some of the scarier images that we see kind of in our pop culture. But I would say the vast majority of kids that are dressing up and parents are really wise about, helping them choose costumes that are just fun, and it's a way to get out and to enjoy time in the neighborhood. So I've bumped into people who do have an issue with Halloween, but I've never felt like their rationale was compelling because I think you can use the holiday for a really good purpose without dipping into the darker side of it.
Okay. Well, that's what I was gonna ask you because we have to deal with holidays, all throughout the year, obviously, but where does Halloween kinda rank in comparison to, like, Christmas in terms of the churches you've served? How does it rank in terms of its importance or interest?
Would say it's gonna be a second tier, of course, kinda holiday. Christmas and Easter are gonna be the biggest times, and then I would say probably Halloween is even behind, like, Mother's Day in terms of importance. But, we have done a fall festival, every year of some kind or another, a trunk or treat kind of event, and, in terms of helping congregants get out and meet their neighbors, that's really in the last couple of years a push just to help them to see how they can, use the time to develop friendships and to be more present in the neighborhood. So that's been my experience with it.
Well, have you had people ask you about maybe some of the pagan origins of Halloween? Have you reacted to some of those questions?
What I usually point people to is that before I would say relative to the pagan origin, I don't know as much about it as I maybe would like to. I tend to think of it as more of like a reaction to the Catholic, sort of All Saints Day, and
Yeah.
then you have All Hallows Eve on the evening before, where sort of the ghosts, is sort of a thin place where there's more spirit, creatures, whatever it may be. And so I think of the Catholic Church as kind of, in some ways, almost kind of baptizing, any sort of pagan spiritist kind of thing by celebrating the saints that have gone on before us.
Is it possible to have, I think I'm hearing you say this too, to have more of a nuanced approach to the holiday because on the one hand, it's the Day of the Dead. It's evil. We need to avoid it. And then on the other side, it's just all costumes and candy. Would you say that taking more of a nuanced approach to try to find it a more of a redemptive way to deal with it is the way to go?
Yeah, I think a more nuanced approach is very appropriate. Although I will say, in terms of like, if you were a Christian and you felt like it was important to give maybe a little bit of a different witness on Halloween, you're probably not going to be able to do a whole lot if your child is, still just dressed up as like Buzz Lightyear.
Right.
And they're probably not going to get the message if they're dressed up as the Scream character. So I would say, it's really going to be found not so much in looking a little different if you're really going about the same business as everybody else. The real power of it is going to be found when you are engaging in conversations. So maybe you're inviting a neighbor to come over. Hey, let's cook out together. Then our kids will go trick or treating. Or you're set up in your front yard. Like I know some friends that do s'mores every year. So they have a little fire pit and that's kind of fun. People linger for a little longer. You have a conversation. I think that's how you might be able to have a little more of an impact. But if all you're doing is just kinda doing a little milder version of Halloween, you're probably
Yeah.
mostly going with the flow of everything else.
Yeah. You may have mentioned this before, kind of talking about some of the practices around Halloween, but the dressing up and the costumes, and I think you may have addressed this, but when you were growing up, were there any costumes? I know you have an affinity for Jaws, that you just referenced a short time ago. By the way, that reminds me, my oldest daughter, Ellie, you remember when the movie Finding Nemo came out, that animated?
Sure.
It just
Yeah.
freaked her out. I had to pull her out of there. That's not really related to anything, but I had to
Was it the
unburden
shark?
myself. But as it relates to
Mm.
costumes, you're okay with the whole dressing up thing within reason, maybe?
I am okay with it. I think that it's unfortunate that, some of the darker elements that people really like those things. I'm always amazed at, we probably all have a neighbor that just kinda goes all out for Halloween, and they're putting skeletons in their front yard, they're doing all kinds of things that really create kind of a scary environment, and then when Christmas rolls around, they're just not that active. So,
Really?
that says to me, I think about, like, there are those that I know people who Halloween is their favorite holiday. And I don't want to come across as judgmental in this, but I do think about like the word that says, well, the light is coming to the world, but people love the darkness. And I do think there's a certain element in our culture that loves the darkness and really glorifies the darkness. So whenever I pass by those homes, that's sort of the thought that I typically have.
What you just said there, I was reminded of a quote. Al Mohler said this several years ago about Halloween. He said it was a moral issue, but he was talking about how it's a pagan festival and it kind of celebrates death and our fascination with violence. But he also said that when people dress up as ghosts and goblins, they're not really thinking about the pagan background. They're not thinking theologically. Do you think most people, when they dress up in these scary characters, they're trying to make a kind of a spiritual statement, or are they just trying to have a good time?
They're just trying to have a good time. I think they're enjoying the day. Certainly, they're having a good time with their kids if they have kids or grandkids. And, I would say from a Christian standpoint, we don't gain any ground by, coming down hard on people that's their whole motivation.
Yeah,
So I don't have any problem with it.
yeah. So the dressing up in costumes, that's gonna take place anyway. What about the trick or treating? I was trying to think about the origins of trick or treating. Do you have any information about that? How
I
that got
don't.
started?
No, I don't know that.
Well,
I don't know
maybe you have
why.
an opinion about this. Is there an age limit to how old someone can be to go trick or treating? Because I'd like some
Yeah.
kind of authoritative response to this.
Yes. Yes. I've thought deeply about this, and I kind of
I'm
feel
sure you
like
did.
if you are, less than the age of 41, I think you should probably not be trick or treating.
Do you
But,
have some data to back this up, or is this
it's just more of internal, observation,
I got it.
is what I'm doing. So, that's my thought. What do you think? What's the age appropriate?
I think if you get to a place where you have children and you embarrass them when you go out, I think that should be a clue, but just by observation, I've just noticed when we do these kind of events that we'll have adults coming by or coming to our door, and some of them are kind of retirement age and doing that, so I think at some point you have to kinda let it go. Is it okay to use these pre-sealed communion cups to hand out to the trick-or-treaters, Brent? Have you stopped doing that, or is that still something you've considered?
Well, I think I wanna correct the misconception that we ever did that to start out. We never did that, but I would say if you're doing that, then we need to pray for you, Danny.
Okay.
I would say stop that immediately, but hey, you follow
They're
your
too small
conscience.
to put your QR code on there. You could try to do that.
That's interesting. Yeah, yeah. All the kids with their smartphones, right.
Sure, yeah.
Scanning for local church information. That's
Yeah.
good. That's good. Yeah.
Well, let's hit some of the scriptural and theological basis for, the holiday, and I was wondering, are there any passages you have used around Halloween, or any themes that maybe have resonated with what's going on with Halloween?
Yeah. Well, on occasion, I have talked about the place of fear in our lives. So I'll preach a message about what the Bible has to say about fear and the way that Christ came with a message of not being afraid, echoing the Old Testament, but also the early church that would move forward with really addressing the fears that tend to weigh down our hearts. So that's a message that I would say if I'm going to preach on something, although typically I don't do anything special about it. I'm just kind of going with the flow of whatever message series I'm in at the moment.
I think we talked about this before. Do you preach along the lectionary, or do you kinda go your own way with that?
I do not use the lectionary.
Yeah.
On occasion, I will do the lectionary for like some of the seasons, like Advent and the Lenten season. But by and large, I plan out a year in advance and I sit down over a series of days and just think about where our congregation is in a prayerful kind of place where I believe we need to be hearing from the word. So that's what I do.
Okay. There are several references in the scripture about well, before we got on here, started talking, I was looking at the example of the witch of Endor, when
Okay.
Saul tried to conjure up, the image of Samuel, there are references to ghosts and witches and demons in the scripture. In your ministry and your work with churches, how have you dealt with those things
Yeah.
when people have talked to you about them?
Yeah. Well, on a lot of other occasions, I've talked about Jesus having power over the demonic. In fact, I'm in the middle of a Wednesday series right now about angels and demons. And so, how do those celestial creatures kind of show up throughout the scripture? I think we got to address that, Danny, because it's right there. When the Bible talks about mental illness, but it also talks about the presence of the demonic.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so, I think um, we hurt ourselves when we're not honest about that. And the Bible gospel writers certainly understood about illness and disease, and they also talked about the presence of the demonic. So I think we've got to wrestle with Jesus's capacity to heal and deliver in both of those instances.
This is a generalization, Brent, but do you think the church, do we do a good job with doing that, addressing kind of our battle is not with flesh and blood, but with the spiritual forces? Do you think we kind of tend to shy away from that, or do we have an overemphasis with that? Because I know it seems like there have been a number of books, fiction books, that have come out that relate to the spiritual world, and I was just trying to think from your own perspective, how do we find that balance?
Yeah. My take on this, Danny, is that people treat it one of two ways incorrectly. One is they don't pay enough attention to it. So that's kind of one side of the road, the ditch to fall into. They either don't pay attention to it at all or they pay way too much attention to it so that they sort of get pushed around looking for the demonic and blaming the demonic on all kinds of issues. So I think there's a balance in there. Now, are you a lectionary preacher?
No, I'm not. I kinda do, like, Advent. I go select passages for Advent and then for Lent, and then I just try to see where our church needs to be.
Yeah.
But I try to observe some of these holidays too.
So how do you preach on this? What do you typically address? Or is it around something around the spirit world in
I have
particular?
used a passage out of Ephesians about the armor of God in the spiritual battle. Actually, I was going back to think about some of the scriptures I have referenced, and one of them had to do, of course, with the raising of Lazarus, from the dead, and then, of course, Jesus walking on water and trying to kind of lean into the fact that's where people's minds are
Hmm.
already. I think one of the things I run into is, whether consciously or not, I think people think that there's some kind of an equality that exists between God and Satan, and that's something we need to definitely push back against.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, if we think of those powers as being equal, but the Bible says that Satan was a fallen angel and a beautiful one at that, but not in any way having the same power. God has self limited in allowing the work of the devil to impact our lives, but we shouldn't ever think that somehow those two things are equal. Sometimes you ever seen that picture of like Jesus arm wrestling Satan, like this great cosmic battle's happening?
No, I haven't seen that one.
And if you think about the
That's not on your
power,
wall back there, is it? I don't think I see that one.
no, I did have a cross stitch pillow kind of made out of that because I just was so inspired by it. But The, uh, the picture is just not right. I mean, if you think about these two sort of equal forces clashing together. So I think we lean into what the Bible has to say but and have to push back against those kind of cultural misrepresentations that are often out there.
Yeah. You were talking about dressing up as scary characters and things like that. I remember kind of as a teenager, and I think this is still a thing. They call them judgment houses, or sometimes they
Yes.
call them hell houses or something like that. How do you feel about this concept of trying to? I guess they're trying to put the fear of God into people, especially teenagers. How do you feel about that kind of approach to the holiday and trying to scare kids?
I don't like it at all. I feel like someone who is scared into a decision to follow Christ is different from someone that has like an understanding of themselves and their need for grace because of sin. And I think my experience with those judgment houses, hell houses, whatever they may be, is that they're often really, really gritty, kind of frightening places for kids. And often, like, having things like abortion clinics,
Yeah.
and chainsaw room, and just like
It's surprising how graphic some of them can be.
yeah, it's very graphic. So then to try to sort of present the gospel after seeing something like that, I just think sets up a kid for some spiritual trauma that's
Okay.
probably gonna have to be worked through in the future.
Yeah. Like I said, just around here, I know churches deal with this in different ways, and I'm not going out of my way to try to find out where these hell houses are, but I've always had an issue with that for the reasons that you mentioned. On the flip side, though, what are some positive things that the church can do to deal with Halloween? And I think you mentioned this before. We don't necessarily need to condemn people for their view on Halloween, do we?
No, no. I mean, honestly, Danny, we're not here to condemn anybody. We're not in the condemning business, right? We're here to represent Christ well in the world and to really present people with an alternative to the life that they may be chasing in one direction or another. So I think that fall festivals are good, kind of games and candy and that kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that how we show up in our neighborhoods can really make a big difference during Halloween. We can, demonstrate a care for our neighbors and maybe reach out to someone we don't know very well, just as a way of saying, hey, I want to build a relationship with you and just take people where they are, not necessarily where we want them to be, but to find ways to build a bridge that demonstrates care, I think is the posture that we need to be taking.
Well, of course, October 31st, we call it Halloween, but it's All Hallows Eve, right? And
Yes.
that's also the day when you talked about someone to dress up as, you mentioned Jaws. I was teeing you up to say Martin Luther, but you opted not to go that direction. But let's give a little credibility and credence to Martin Luther a little bit about what happened. Can you give a little bit of background on Martin Luther in October 1517?
Yeah, so 1517, as I understand it, Martin Luther essentially dressed up as a reformer, and he nailed his 95
His
theses
mother
to the
made the
wooden.
outfit for him and gave it to him.
That's right, yeah. So, what we now think of as a reformer, that's what he was doing. He nails these 95 theses to the did I say feces? Theses, yes, to the Wittenberg door. By the way, there was a great satire magazine years ago called The Door. Do you remember this?
Yes.
I
Yes.
love that. I
Is
love
it
The
still is
Door.
it still a thing, or is it not in publication anymore?
I think there may be an online version of it, but I'm not on their mailing list or
Yeah.
or anything like that. Essentially, that Reformation Day, November the 1st, All Saints Day, it does feel like I wonder if for Christians we might cultivate something of a balance, where on the one hand we're enjoying the fun of Halloween, but could we use it as a way to remember the saints, those that have gone on before us and that have made a difference in our lives? I think that's one way that we can make the holiday a little more honoring of Christ and to remember the great cloud of witnesses that's gone on before us.
Well, we were talking about this a few moments ago before we started recording. I guess All Saints Day, and then your own church has a way of recognizing those who were in your congregation and have gone on to the Lord. Do you find that to be an important observance, and how does that help the church when you do that?
Yeah, our church members find it very meaningful when we pause to remember people because my experience has been let's say if someone has a deep loss, maybe the loss of a spouse, a lot of people show up after the death and maybe they come to the funeral. But a lot of people kind of forget and they sort of move on. And I think this is an opportunity just to help families to know, hey, we remember. We remember. And the loss of this person in your life. I think it's a way to honor those lives, but also to help families to know that we grieve with those who grieve. That's one of the biblical mandates of the church. So what we did on Sunday was we said the names of each person, and after each name, we had a bell that would toll, like one of our handbells, and then we had either a family member or a close, friendship within the church to go and to light a candle on the altar. So, by the time we finished, our altar was just kind of lit up with this visual representation of those that had gone on before us. And as the Bible says in Hebrews, they're really still with us. Now they're and that great cloud of witnesses that watches over us and cheers us on. So it was very meaningful. I think families found it meaningful as well.
Well, thinking about this topic of death, which seems to kind of go with the holiday, I was doing a little bit of reading. David Gushee, the ethicist, was writing on Halloween saints and souls, and how he was talking about how we need to recover this emphasis in our churches. But what he was talking about is how sometimes, I guess this would be true with spouses or children, if they had a certain place they sat in the sanctuary and they had their pew, they talked about how difficult it was to move to another pew, and they needed some reassurance to help them recognize they were in the invisible church. And I know you touched on this, but do you feel like it's an uncomfortable topic to talk
Mhm.
about, isn't it? We try to give attention to it once a year, but as you said, we really need to be mindful of that, especially if you have a number of losses in your church. This cumulative effect can impact really all of us, can it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And how do you talk about death without allowing the whole sort of atmosphere to become just dreary? But I do think that talking about death has a way, of course, of illuminating life and what we have today. So I think it's good to be reminded from time to time, hey, life is short and not one of us is promised more than what we have today. And how are we using the time that God has given to us? So maybe Halloween can kind of help with that function as well,
Of
just to, remind people of how life really is short and it counts what we do today.
course, Catholic Church, they have saints, or they canonize, or they call someone a saint. Baptists historically have not done that sort of thing. I think we can go the other extreme and not recognize the fact that collectively we are the saints. I was wondering, are there people in your life that you would think that person could be considered a quote unquote saint of some caliber? And can you maybe identify one or two people that have had a great impact in your life that you think, wow, that person could be part of the saints?
Sure. I think of one person in particular that I did not actually know very well. I only knew her for a couple of years. Her name was Ethel, and she was here at First Baptist Knoxville. And Ethel was just always doing things. She was always serving people, taking food to people. She was one of those persons who going through the sanctuary and kind of resetting everything, getting rid of all the old bulletins and putting the hymnals back in place. She became known as Saint Ethel around our church. And I don't know how that name came around, but she just
Was
had
that an
this.
elected position, or was that just kind of an appointed?
I think it was more appointed.
Yeah.
I don't know if it raised the bar for her, in terms of how she acted, but, just to think about the lives of just people who are always doing the work of ministry. Those who do it with humility, who don't want the limelight, those who are serving, in the name of Christ all the time. Those are the ones that the Bible describes. Those are the ones that the Bible describes as saints. And I think of others in my life too. Like my grandmother, I feel like was a saint to me. She blessed me. She always encouraged me. She always told me that she prayed that the angels would watch over me. I never forget that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've had a couple people in my life that have just really represented what I think of as a saint.
Well, I'm grateful that you were on our show today. I was going to ask if for people who are listening in, if they want to follow you. I know that you have a show of your own and you have a website. Could you tell us a little bit about that if we want to learn more about you and the work you're doing?
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Well, so I'm with First Baptist Knoxville, Tennessee, and fbcknox.org is our website. You can learn about our church there, service times, and all sorts of things. Recently, we developed a couple of new things. One is the website prayerpower.com that is kind of a springboard from a book that I wrote years ago about how to learn how to pray like George Mueller. And the book is called Prayer Power is a place where people can get resources on how to learn how to pray, videos for small groups. You can sign up for a daily devotion and some other things. So we've also, Danny, recently launched a radio show. So it's on Joy 620, which on the FM dial is 102.5 around the Knoxville area, 99.5 in Sevierville. And that radio show is called Prayer Power with Brent McDougall. It's on every Saturday from 11 to 12 and just learning the ways of Jesus about prayer. So would love for people to check that out.
Well, I appreciate that. And I enjoyed being on your program the other day, and I encourage our listeners to check that out. Any final thoughts on Halloween?
There is that kind of idea of fear around this holiday. We sort of let ourselves be a little afraid by some of these things. I think, Danny, there's a lot of fear in our culture in
Yeah,
general right now. People read the news, they feel afraid. People see the stock market go up and down. They see their coffee prices rising by 40%. There's just a lot of fear. And I think that can be a springboard to reflect on, okay, what makes our hearts fearful? And how can the Spirit of Christ more deeply embody our hearts so that we're not walking around with fear, but we're walking around with peace? And I would just say Halloween's a great time to do some of that reflection.
that's a good word, Brian. I really appreciate your friendship and being on today. And like I said earlier, we'll try to regather the troops later on, maybe around Thanksgiving. But I want to thank our listeners for joining us today and being part of this conversation with Dr. Brent McDougall, pastor of First Baptist Church of Knoxville. And I want to thank you for listening. And if you're not following the podcast, please do so. Happy Halloween, and thanks for listening.